The turkey was still steaming on the table when my mother stood up and pointed at the door like I was something to be swept out with the crumbs. "Get out," she said. "Take your daughter with you." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound in that dining room was the clink of my sister's wine glass as she set it down, smirking, like she'd been waiting all night for exactly this. I remember the smell of cinnamon and roasted turkey still hanging in the air, the candles still flickering on the table, and underneath all of it, my daughter's small hand tightening around mine. She was 6 years old. She didn't understand what was happening. But she understood enough to be afraid. And that, more than anything my mother said that night, is the moment I will never forgive. "Why?" I asked, even though some part of me already knew the answer before I finished the question. "Because you're divorced now," my mother said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the silence like a blade through the good china. "And divorced women don't deserve a seat at this table. Not on Christmas. Not in my house." My sister laughed. An actual laugh, like this was entertainment, like watching her own sister get thrown out in front of a 6-year-old was the punchline to a joke only she was in on. My daughter's eyes searched my face for an answer she deserved but that I could not give her in that room, in front of those people. "Mama," she whispered, "did we do something wrong?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat had closed around every word I owned. So I picked up her coat, took her hand, and walked out into the cold without saying a single thing back to the family that had just decided we weren't worth a chair at their table. But that night wasn't where my story started. And it wasn't where it ended either. What happened in the 8 years that followed, the choices my mother and sister made, and the exact moment they both realized what they had thrown away, that's the part nobody in that dining room ever saw coming. My name is Winslet, and 2 years before that Christmas, I was still married to a man named Grant, living in a house that looked perfect from the outside and felt like a locked room from the inside. We met in college. He was charming in that easy, practiced way that made everyone assume he'd make a good husband. Steady job, polite to waiters, never forgot a birthday. My mother, Adeline, adored him instantly. She used to say he was the kind of man who fixes things. For a few years, I believed her too. Our daughter Josie was born when I was 26, with my dark hair and Grant's quiet, watchful eyes. For a while we were exactly the family everyone assumed we'd be. But somewhere around Josie's 3rd birthday, Grant started staying later at work. Then he started taking calls in the garage with the door shut. Then he started looking at me the way you look at a task you haven't gotten around to yet. I found out about the affair the way most women do, by accident. A message left open on a shared tablet. A name I didn't recognize. Months of conversation I'd had no idea existed. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it. He didn't even look sorry. He just said, "I didn't think you'd notice," like that was supposed to pass for an apology. I filed for divorce 4 months later. There were no screaming matches, no thrown plates, just the slow, quiet unraveling of a life I had built around the wrong person. Grant signed the papers, took his half of the furniture, and moved 2 states away with the woman from the tablet. Josie was 5 when it finalized. What nobody tells you about the end of a marriage is how much grief comes wrapped in paperwork, mediation sessions where the man who broke your heart discusses bank accounts in the same flat tone he'd use for a grocery list, nights spent sitting in your daughter's room just listening to her breathe, trying to find the words to explain something to a 5-year-old that you barely understand yourself. I settled on the simplest version I could manage. "Daddy and I are going to live in different houses now, but we both love you exactly the same." She accepted it the way small children accept most things, without fully understanding, but trusting the adults around her had it handled. I did not, in fact, have it handled. I was improvising every single day, and some part of me already sensed that the hardest part wasn't Grant leaving. It was what was coming next. I didn't tell my family right away. I knew exactly how my mother would react before she even opened her mouth. Adeline had a talent for turning other people's pain into a referendum on her own reputation. When I finally called her, I kept it short. "Grant and I are getting divorced." He was seeing someone else. There was a pause on the line, not shock, not sympathy, just calculation. Then she said, "Well, what did you do to push him there?" I remember standing in my kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, feeling something in my chest go completely still. Not anger. Something colder than anger. I told her I needed to check on Josie, and I hung up. My sister Lorraine was different, or at least I thought she was back then. She was 2 years older than me, married to a man in commercial real estate, with a house on a circular driveway and an identity built entirely around being the successful one. When I told her about the divorce, she didn't say anything outright cruel. She just asked questions that felt like accusations wearing a disguise. Did you try counseling? Are you sure you didn't miss the signs? What are you going to do about money now? Every question was a small hook, digging for a reason to place the blame back on me. I answered them anyway, because I still believed, back then, that my family would come around. I didn't yet understand that some people don't come around. They just wait for a new excuse. The first real test came with the apartment search. Our house had to be sold and the proceeds split, a process that dragged on for nearly 5 months while I needed somewhere to live with a 5-year-old and a part-time bookkeeping job that didn't remotely cover a security deposit. I asked my mother if we could stay with her temporarily. I remember her exact words. "I don't think that's a good idea. You know how people talk in this neighborhood. A single mother staying here doesn't exactly send the right message." The right message, as if my daughter and I were a public relations problem instead of family in a difficult moment. I didn't even bother asking Lorraine. I already knew what her answer would be, dressed up in something softer, but landing in exactly the same place. So I found a small 2-bedroom rental on the edge of town, the kind of place with a landlord who took cash and a radiator that clanked all night long. And that's where the real struggle began, the kind nobody at that Christmas table would ever know about. For the first year after the divorce, money was a constant, quiet terror. I did math in my head at the grocery store, putting things back on the shelf as the total climbed too fast. I told Josie we were having a picnic dinner on the living room floor because I hadn't been able to afford a table yet. She thought it was fun. She had no idea it was because I couldn't buy furniture and groceries in the same month. Grant support payments were inconsistent at best, always wrapped in some excuse about his new life, his new priorities. There was one month I still remember with painful clarity. Josie needed $20 for a school supply fee, and I genuinely did not have it. I swallowed every ounce of pride I had left and called Grant. He said he'd call me back. He never did. I sold a necklace my grandmother had left me to a pawn shop 2 towns over, quietly, on a Tuesday afternoon while Josie was at school, and I never told a single soul about it until now. I tell you this not for sympathy, but because I think it matters. The version of struggle nobody sees on the outside is usually the heaviest part to carry. And through all of it, my mother and sister were present in a strange, hollow way. A birthday call here. A Christmas card there. But when I actually needed something, a place to stay, even just someone to ask how I was really doing, they went quiet. My mother would change the subject to Lorraine's latest home renovation. Lorraine would mention some charity gala, as if reminding me of the distance between our lives was a form of comfort. Looking back now, I understand what was happening. My mother had built her entire identity around the appearance of a certain kind of family, successful, married, presentable. My divorce didn't fit that picture. And instead of adjusting the picture, she decided to cut me out of the frame entirely. But even I couldn't have predicted how far she'd go to protect that image. That brings us back to the Christmas I told you about. It had been nearly 8 months since the divorce finalized. I was still in the rental, still stretching every dollar, but starting to feel slightly more stable. I'd picked up 2 new clients that fall, enough to finally buy real winter coats instead of layering thin ones under blankets. When my mother called in early December and invited us to Christmas dinner, I let myself feel something dangerous, hope. I told myself maybe this was the olive branch. I bought Josie a new dress for the occasion. I brought a bottle of wine I couldn't really afford, because I wanted to walk in looking like I had it together, even if I didn't quite believe it yet. Josie kept asking questions the whole drive over. Will Grandma have the big tree up? Will Aunt Lorraine's dog be there? She had no idea what was waiting for her inside that house. The dinner started normally enough, awkward, but normal. My mother made a comment about my job being cute for now, which stung, but I let it go. Lorraine talked about a coastal trip she and her husband were planning, deliberately not inviting us, though the gesture wasn't lost on anyone. Then, halfway through the meal, my mother's brother-in-law made an offhand comment about how nice it was to have the whole family together. My mother's face changed instantly. She set down her fork with a sharp clink against the china and said, loud enough for the entire table to hear, "Well, it's not really the whole family, is it? Winslet isn't really family anymore. Not since the divorce." I asked her carefully what she meant. That's when she stood up. That's when she pointed at the door. That's when she said the words that would replay in my head for years, that divorced women didn't deserve a seat at her table. And that's when Lorraine laughed. I want you to sit with that for a second, the way I've had to sit with it for years. My own sister watching her 6-year-old niece absorb the message that she and her mother weren't worth including in a holiday dinner, and her first reaction being amusement. Josie's small hand found mine under the table before I even stood up. She looked up at me with an expression I will never forget, not confusion exactly, but a dawning understanding that something had gone very wrong, and that the adults in the room who were supposed to protect her weren't going to. "Mama," she whispered again, "did we do something wrong?" I picked up her coat from the back of the chair, took her small hand in mine, and walked out without another word. We sat in the car for almost 10 minutes before I could make myself start the engine. Josie cried quietly in her car seat. I cried at the steering wheel. Neither of us said anything, because there was nothing that could make sense of what had just happened to a 6-year-old on Christmas. But that night, once she was finally asleep, I sat at our small kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold in front of me, and I made a decision that would define the next several years of my life. I decided I was done. Not done being angry, that would take much longer, but done waiting for my mother and sister to decide I was worth including. I blocked my mother's number that night. I blocked Lorraine's a week later, after she sent a single text that read, "Mom didn't mean it like that. Don't be so dramatic," which somehow made everything worse. What followed were, without exaggeration, the hardest years of my life. But they were also the years I became someone I actually respected. I took an online course in advanced bookkeeping at night after Josie went to bed, running on 4 hours of sleep before full days of client work. I picked up every client I could find, even the difficult ones, even the ones who paid late, because every client was a brick in a foundation I was building without anyone's help. By the time Josie turned 8, we'd left that rental behind for a slightly bigger place. I remember our first night there, eating pizza on the floor because we still didn't have a table, and Josie looking at me and saying, "This is our best picnic dinner yet." I laughed until I cried, a good kind of crying, for once. Around Josie's 9th birthday, a client asked if I'd come on full-time to handle their books internally. It wasn't a huge raise, but it meant stability, benefits, predictability, things I hadn't had in years. I said yes immediately. I got better at the job. I got promoted twice. I opened savings accounts for Josie's education and, for the first time in my life, for myself, something I'd never done during my marriage, when every dollar had somehow always belonged to someone else's priorities first. Grant reappeared briefly around Josie's 10th birthday, suggesting we try being a family again for her sake. I waited for the old fear to rise up in me, the one that used to make me shrink myself smaller to keep a man comfortable. It didn't come. I told him Josie already had a family, an imperfect one in some ways, but a stable one, built by people who showed up consistently, which was more than he had ever managed. He didn't call again for almost 2 years, and after that, only brief, logistical conversations about school. By the time Josie was 15, she'd stopped bringing him up entirely, and I never pushed her to. By the time she turned 12, I'd left the stable paycheck behind to start my own financial consulting practice, working with small business owners who needed someone to untangle their books. It was terrifying, but I had years of proof by then that I could build something out of almost nothing. The business grew slowly, then all at once. Within 2 years, I'd hired my first employee, then my second. Somewhere in the middle of that growth, a soft-spoken accountant named Holden, someone I'd met briefly years earlier at a networking event, resurfaced, referring overflow clients to my practice. Coffee meetings that started out about business slowly became something else entirely. He was steady in a way that felt earned, not performed, the opposite of the charm I'd once mistaken for stability in Grant. I was cautious with him, testing whether his patience was real. It was. He became the first person outside of Josie who made me feel like building a second chance wasn't naive. It was just overdue. I promised myself I would never again let a man's presence in my life come at the cost of my daughter's sense of safety, and Josie was part of every conversation about what our future might look like. I want to be honest, I didn't spend those years thinking constantly about my mother and sister. Revenge wasn't the engine driving me forward. Watching Josie grow into a confident, curious teenager who never doubted her own value was the thing that mattered most. But every so often, in quiet moments, I thought about that Christmas. I thought about my mother's voice saying divorced women didn't deserve a seat at her table. And I let that memory fuel something steady in me, not bitterness exactly, but resolve. Through those 8 years of silence, I heard fragments of news through distant relatives who hadn't fully picked a side. Lorraine's husband's business had collapsed in an economic downturn, and they'd been forced to sell the house with the circular driveway. My mother, now in her 70s, had developed health issues, and Lorraine had become her reluctant caretaker, a role she apparently resented and complained about to anyone who'd listen. I felt something hearing that news, but it wasn't satisfaction. It was more like watching weather happen to people from a great distance, recognizing the storm, but no longer standing inside it. My cousin Priscilla told me once that my mother had asked, during a health scare, "I wonder how Winslet is doing," to a room that had no answer, because none of them had spoken to me in years either. I didn't feel triumphant hearing that. I felt tired, the specific exhaustion of realizing someone who could have picked up the phone at any point simply chose not to, year after year, and only wondered about the daughter she'd cast out once illness made her reflective. Wondering isn't the same as reaching out. I'd learned that distinction the hard way. The real turning point came when Josie was 16. My mother, now 73, and increasingly unwell, had instructed a lawyer to update her will. According to Priscilla, the estate, modest but not insignificant, thanks to a family property that had appreciated over the years, was set to be divided between Lorraine and a set of favored grandchildren from her side. My name and Josie's were absent entirely. I felt almost nothing at first. I hadn't expected anything from my mother in years. But then Priscilla mentioned something else, that my mother had specifically instructed her lawyer to note, in writing, that Winslet had abandoned the family and forfeited any claim to inheritance. Abandoned. As if walking out of a house where I'd just been told I wasn't welcome was some kind of betrayal on my part. That single word sat with me for weeks, because it revealed something I hadn't fully let myself see before. My mother wasn't just cold or old-fashioned. She had rewritten the entire history of that Christmas, recasting herself as the wounded party and me as the one who chose to disappear. And that was the moment I finally decided to answer back. I didn't call. I wrote a letter, the kind I never got to deliver in the moment my voice had failed me at that dinner table. I kept it factual, not emotional. I reminded her exactly what had happened that Christmas. Her words, her tone, Lorraine's laughter, and the question a 6-year-old had asked that neither of us could answer. I told her the honest answer was no, we hadn't done anything wrong. The only people who had done something wrong that night were the adults who chose cruelty over compassion and comfort over their own family. I sent it through Priscilla, since I had no direct contact I trusted, and for nearly 2 months I heard nothing. Then, unexpectedly, Lorraine called, not my mother. Her voice sounded smaller than I remembered, worn down by years of caretaking and financial stress. She told me our mother's health had declined further, that she was exhausted, both financially and emotionally. And then, almost as an afterthought, she said something I'll remember for the rest of my life. I think about that Christmas sometimes. I don't know why I laughed. I've never told anyone that. I didn't offer forgiveness in that moment, because I didn't feel it yet, and I've learned that manufacturing forgiveness before you're ready only teaches people that cruelty has no lasting cost. I told her that an apology 8 years late, prompted by desperation rather than genuine reflection, wasn't something I could simply accept as though nothing had happened. She didn't argue. She just went quiet, then said, "That's fair," in a voice that sounded like she'd expected exactly that answer, and had called anyway because some part of her needed to say the words out loud. When my mother passed away the following spring, the estate turned out to be more complicated than she had expected. Priscilla and two other relatives who'd learned about the abandonment language raised concerns with the estate's executor, since several of them, including my uncle, had personally witnessed what actually happened that Christmas. After months of legal back and forth, a portion of the estate was ultimately placed into a trust for Josie, released to her once she turned 18. Lorraine did not contest it. I think by then she understood exactly what had been done, and to whom, and that pretending otherwise wasn't a fight she had the appetite for anymore. I never got a detailed explanation of how the legal process landed where it did, and honestly, I didn't need one. What mattered was simpler than any clause or filing. The story my mother had tried to tell about that Christmas didn't hold up once the people who'd actually been in the room were asked what they remembered. I won't pretend there wasn't a strange kind of vindication in that. Not joy exactly. More like watching a door that had been slammed in your face years earlier quietly swing back open, long after you'd stopped waiting for it. I didn't attend the funeral. I sent Josie, 18 by then, who made her own choice to go with a maturity I don't think I fully had at her age. She told me afterward that Lorraine had approached her quietly at the reception and said, "Your mother built something incredible without any of us." Josie relayed the message exactly as it was given, without embellishment, the way she relays most things, carefully, honestly. I didn't cry when she told me. I think I'd already done most of my crying years earlier, at a kitchen table with cold tea, deciding to build a life that didn't need anyone's permission to be worth living. Today, my consulting practice has grown well beyond anything I imagined during those pizza-on-the-floor years. Josie is studying business at university, in part, she says, because she watched her mother rebuild an entire life with nothing but persistence and wanted to understand how that kind of resilience actually works from the ground up. Lorraine and I still don't speak much, though the silence feels less like a wound now and more like simple distance, the natural result of two lives that grew in very different directions after one particular Christmas. Holden and I are still together, quietly, steadily, in a way that never needed a grand gesture to feel permanent. Josie once asked if I'd ever marry again, and I told her the truth, that I finally understood the difference between a partner and a project, and I was in no hurry to trade the peace I'd built for anything less. I think about that night sometimes, not with the raw pain it used to carry, but with a kind of clarity. My mother stood up at her own table and decided that a divorced woman and her 6-year-old daughter weren't worth including. She thought she was protecting her image. What she was actually doing was writing the first page of a story that would end with her own granddaughter inheriting what she tried to withhold, and her own daughter building a life so stable, so complete, that the rejection eventually became nothing more than a story, a hard one, but just a story in the end. Josie still asks me, only half joking now, whether we did something wrong that night. And I always give her the same answer, because I finally found the courage to believe it myself. No. We didn't do anything wrong. We just weren't willing to shrink ourselves to fit inside a room that was never built to hold us in the first place. If you were sitting at that table, watching a 6-year-old ask if she'd done something wrong, would you have found the courage to walk out too, or would you have stayed quiet?